All right, so welcome everyone to CHPC's webinar for National Grief and Bereavement Day called Everybody Grieves. And it's much too true, but we need to learn how to cope with it, which is why we have our wonderful speaker, Maria Vassiliou from Filotimo Life. Thank you, Maria, for presenting today. And I will hand it over to you and then we can get started.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. Before we get started, I want to do a quick poll just to get to know you guys a little bit. And just to keep in mind, the session will be a little bit interactive. So this is the first interactive piece. Kat just sent it through, and if you can answer the question, what brought you here today? Either I've experienced a loss, a loved one is grieving, or I'm simply here to learn. A few more seconds. Okay, I think we can go ahead and end. Awesome. So it's a mix of people. I've experienced a loss, I'm here to learn, as well as a loved one is grieving. Thank you so much for filling that out, guys. So today we'll look to define what grief means. We'll look at types of grief responses and ways to identify it, whether it's for yourself or for your loved ones. And finally, look at ways you can help to process grief yourself and to help others process it as well. At the end of the presentation, I'd love to hear in your own words what you took away from the session, either in the chat or we can have a small discussion. So feel free to post your answers or feel free to post your questions in the chat. First, to give you some background on who I am and what I do, I am a thanatologist and a practitioner in the space for about 15 years. This is my mom, Frida Vassiliou, who died when I was 2 years old. I often joke that I am one dead parent away from becoming Batman. It's okay to laugh, we're all friends here. As a result of her death, a lot of my interests, particularly as a kid, revolved around different cultures and their ideas of death and dying. There was a period of time when I was 10 years old when I wanted to become a coroner when I grew up. For whatever reason, my family saw nothing wrong with this as a career path for a 10-year-old and decided to not put me into therapy, which is a story for another time. So growing up, I saw that there were glaringly obvious gaps within social policies, education, and healthcare systems as it comes to death literacy. We aren't taught how to speak about death and grief. We have limited bereavement leave for only a few privileged individuals, and there is a lack of resources and support as it comes to hospice and palliative care, in addition to the idea of death being seen as a medical failure, when the truth is that it's a reality of life. Over the course of the last few years, I've realized that we need to address these gaps and ensure that death literacy is considered life literacy. I believe doing this will greatly change and shift our outlooks on everything in life and in our society. This is why I founded Filotimo Life. We produce educational resources and materials around the subjects of death, dying, and grief in a relatable, empathetic, and engaging way. We do this to modernize death policies and to normalize the conversation around death. One of our most digestible pieces of material right now is our podcast. Topics that we do cover include grief, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. Because people interpret words differently, we're going to look at what grief is. Grief is a common human experience and is a person's personal reaction to a loss, which can vary between individuals. A more textbook definition is the process of psychological, social, and somatic reactions to a perception of a loss. When it comes to grief, a person's journey in healing can be very similar to the process of healing physically, though through different types of therapy and even treatments. It's important to be able to label this emotion when you experience it, which we will talk about shortly. Outside of this textbook definition, grief can be described as the emotional distress you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. Knowing what grief is important, as well as what can cause it. Most of us are familiar with grief being the result of experiencing the death of a loved one, though there are also other causes of grief. I want us to take about 5 minutes here to think of situations that can cause grief aside from experiencing a death. We'll use this Jamboard link where you can add your own sticky notes to answer the question. What causes grief? Kat will add the link to the chat for all of us to access. If anyone has any difficulties, please let us know. And for those who are new to Jamboards, you can click the sticky note right here to add your own note. I'll add as one, click save, and you can add it there. Big life change, divorce, loss of our old selves, loss of employment, job loss, immense life changes. Yep, these are all awesome. Loss of a close friend, end of relationships. Yeah, that's definitely when people overlook when it comes to loss. Yeah, Debbie posted in the chat, COVID restrictions, being away from loved ones. Yeah. Awesome. Loss of independence. If there's anyone that also wants to speak to the sticky notes that they're adding, please feel free also to unmute yourself and share. Awesome. Medical illness, loss, mobility. Yep. Yeah. Loss of possibility is a huge one. Loss of potential futures. Awesome. So if no one wants to unmute themselves and to share anything else, I will keep going. Yeah, these are all great. Thank you for sharing. Oh no, I don't know why that's there. All right. So great job on the jam board. Yes, so grief is the emotional distress you feel when someone or something you love is taken away. Situations that can trigger moments of grief can include divorce, retirement, illness diagnosis, graduations, work promotions, marriage, and even home buying. There are little deaths that take place in life, in any type of life transitions. In the case of marriage, a little death may be having to leave the family home. There's a comfort that you had with your family, with certain routines that you set up. Those will no longer exist in this new phase of life, which can cause feelings of grief. Same with graduations, where you're moving from the consistency of school and friends to a new one, which can involve new experiences, new routines, and unknown situations. I like to use this as a visual example when it comes to someone processing a loss, whether it's a death or otherwise. We all start with a pre-loss state. In the context of marriage, it can be living at home with a family, having certain home-cooked meals, and seeing certain people every day. The post-loss state is what happens once you move out and relationships shift. You no longer are at home with your family. You may be in a new home with new food to eat and seeing different people every day. Regardless of the life transition you're going through, whether it's marriage, a promotion, divorce, or a death of a loved one, you need to transition from your pre-loss state, which no longer exists, into your post-loss state, which is your new reality. It's important for you in these life transitions to create a new sense of normalcy in your post-loss state and recognize that there is no going back to your pre-loss time period. Now to dive into grief responses and what those may look like for some people. Before I do, I want to touch on the importance of being able to label grief. So I'm sure many of you saw this article when it came out in early 2020 in light of the pandemic, titled "The Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." For those who are unfamiliar, this article speaks about the uneasiness many of us were feeling and facing at the beginning of 2020. I know for myself, there were several weeks that went by where I felt very uneasy and almost uncomfortable in my own space and body, and I was unsure why. I knew it was the result of lockdowns, though the answer wasn't necessarily enough at the time to calm my own nerves. It wasn't until I read this article that I was able to recognize and realize that I was experiencing grief. I was grieving our previous lives, lost opportunities, changes in friendship, and changes in relationship dynamics. Those are just a few situations that I was grieving about, some of them that were listed on the Jamboard. This is one of the key quotes from the article. There is something powerful about naming this as grief. It helps us feel what's inside of us. Being able to label and recognize this emotion is important to move through and process it. Being able to label something helps to understand it better and understand yourself better too. There's a power and a level of control brought back to yourself when you're able to identify and label what you're experiencing, whether it's grief or otherwise. It's paramount to know that grief can show up in many ways in a person, and it can be different for individuals. So what can grief feel like? Grief responses can fall under any and all of these 4 categories. They are physical/behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. Grief may express itself in your body as changes in sleep and appetite or moments of forgetfulness. There may be times where you feel irritable for whatever reason, or from a spiritual context, you may dive deeper into religion or choose to pull away from it. Being able to recognize that your insomnia or moments of fatigue or forgetfulness is a result of grief helps to better process it and get the support that's needed. I actually spoke with a wonderful human named Olga Nikolajev, who works in the space and was on our podcast. I recall her speaking to me about how your body stores these feelings and stores trauma, particularly related to grief. She mentions that it's very important that these emotions move through you and to not hold onto it. This is another reason why being able to label it lets you process it. One quote I like to use here is, "What you resist persists." Pushing away your feelings of sadness or anxiety will not make them go away. They will just go down to the basement to lift weights and come back stronger later on. What impacts grief response? Well, there are several variables, and everyone's grief response is going to look different and feel different depending on their age, gender, the relationship they have with the loss, social and cultural beliefs, status quo, your role status, and economic status. These are just some examples of circumstances that can also play a role in how someone expresses their grief. I know for myself, my responses often fall under the physical and emotional buckets. I get aches and pains sometimes, which makes me look into better ways to take care of my body, either through light exercise or massage. Or when I feel myself feeling fatigued or sad, I pour myself into my art and my photography. Everyone's grief response is different, and there's no right or wrong way to grieve. If you're comfortable, you're more than welcome to post in the chat how moments of grief have shown up in your life for the rest of the session. So feel free to go ahead and do that. After you're able to label grief, what does that mean for how you can process and respond to it? Well, I want to show you guys Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When it comes to handling grief, your own or others, it's important to ensure that the physiological needs, which are the basic of the basics, are being met. Grief takes up a lot of energy, especially if you have kids to watch, finances to manage, and have elderly parents to take care of, are a few examples. If the basics aren't being met or are hard to meet, the other needs, such as safety needs and feeling and expressing love and belonging with others, will be that much challenging to meet. I recently did a call out to my network about positive experiences they had with grief and bereavement, and my friend reached out to me in response. She told me that when her dad died, her workplace gave her Metro cards to help cover grocery expenses for the month. She said that this helped alleviate not just food, but also the financial burden as it comes to groceries. And she said it gave her the mental capacity to handle other situations relating to the death of her father. This is also very common for several cultures where they bring cooked meals to a grieving family. When it comes to processing grief, there are moments where people will say or do something that they think is helpful, and the reality is often the opposite. We're going to do a 5 to 7 minute Jamboard breakout session that looks at ways people respond to your grief and how you wish people responded to you. Alternatively, you can reflect on ways you've responded to grief and how your response could have been improved. So Kat will share the Jamboard link in the chat and break you into groups. Please be sure to accept the invite, otherwise you will be stuck in here with me. Awesome. Welcome back, guys. I think everyone's back now. The board is full. I can only imagine the types of conversations that took place, and I see a couple people are still in there. Does anyone want to speak about what they wrote? So I can start and take a look first. Can I take you out for tea? Can I bring you a meal? Was one of the things people wrote. Someone wrote, just get over it, which is probably a common response if anyone wants to talk about that. Tell me a story about them. That's really lovely. Personal one, if anyone wants to talk about this as well, have another baby, you'll feel better. Yeah, some things people say sometimes, it's, I'd like to think it's, again, positive intention here, though definitely room for improvement in some situations. So again, if anyone wants to openly chat, feel free. If not, we'll continue.
I'm just going to add to all of these, as
Yeah.
I said in the breakout room, not saying anything at all. You know, seeing you and not saying anything at all, like knowing quite well that you've experienced a loss and not saying anything about it.
Yeah, 100%. Sometimes silence is what's needed.
Not saying their name or not saying anything.
Sometimes along with that, just holding their hand.
Yeah, just being present, 100%. Thank you guys for sharing. So,
I feel like, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Not saying anything at all could land on both sides. I think sometimes you don't want to talk about it, but other times it might be nice to hear something from someone as well.
Yeah, it's about being present in the moment and understanding what the person might need, because it's going to be different for everyone, right? So a lot of the time we expect people to self-advocate in these situations for what they need. This is hard for people to do on a normal day, and it's even harder for those to do if they're grieving. We often say, reach out to me if you need anything, or something similar. I saw quite a few of those on the board. This puts the onus on the grieving person to do the reaching out, to be more active, which can make them feel uncomfortable, or if they want to avoid feeling like a burden, maybe, or that they're asking for too much from their friends. To get around that, I have a friend named Susan Strigley, who is a professor of Nipissing University. And she told me this method that she has when it comes to supporting her friends and loved ones that I like to call Choose Your Own Adventure Grief Edition. She presents them with a series of options, either via text or email. She lists out things she can do for them, such as picking up groceries, taking the kids to their extracurricular activities, or taking the dog out for a walk. The grieving person then chooses which one they'd like for her friend to do. The grieving person has to choose at least one suggestion and has the ability to ask for all of them to be done. This allows the grieving person to have some control over their situation, and bringing back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this also allows the friend to provide some of the basic needs to their grieving loved one. Say this, not that. So when it comes to communicating about grief, again, most of the time I'd like to imagine that people have positive intentions with everything that they do. Because we aren't taught to have these discussions or educated on how to respond, sometimes people are unsure or are uncomfortable in terms of what to say. We get caught up in the idea of needing to fix something when it comes to grief, when really we need to be present and in the moment with the grief and the grieving person. So here are some examples of what people can say when trying to provide comfort and what can be said instead. Some of these can be used for various life transitions, not necessarily relating to death specifically, while some are more focused on the grief associated with death. So for example, call me anytime. I saw that on the board. This again puts the onus on the grieving person to take action, whereas saying, I will call you in a week to check in, lets them know that you're there for them and you will step in to provide support. Other examples can include everything happens for a reason. Instead of saying that, you can say your loved one was a remarkable person and their death is a terrible loss. Now is not the time to rationalize the situation as to why someone died. Another example is, I can't imagine what you're going through. My one friend who lost her fiance and another friend of mine who actually lost her husband told me that they would prefer if someone were to say, I don't know what to say, and I wish I had the right words, know that I love you, And I'm here to sit with you in this moment, however you need. It goes back to sometimes saying nothing works for some people, right? You can also feel free to take screenshots of the slide if you'd like to refer to it later on, so feel free. Being present, actively listening, and asking questions are vital when it comes to supporting someone in their grief journey. Here are some questions to ask during life transitions. So why are questions important? Well, it removes the impulse of trying to fix something and moving towards being present in that moment. We can't fix the reality of death and other life transitions once they take place. Again, moving from the pre-loss state to the post-loss state. Asking questions gives you a better idea and provides guidance on how the person is feeling and what they're going through. Some questions you can ask include, and again, feel free to take screenshots of the slide. What do you wish people knew about what you're going through right now? How is your family reacting to the news? And what do you want people to remember most about your person? These are some questions that you can ask. I want to leave on the last concept here, which focuses on the idea of closure as it comes to grief. There is this idea that healthy grieving has a specific timeline. People think that this emotion that you feel, if you feel it a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years out, it means that they're broken and not progressing or moving forward. This is a misunderstanding that somehow faster is healthier and better when it comes to grief, which can lead to feelings of guilt if you still have moments of this emotion. The idea that once you hit a certain time, you'll feel closure and almost get over it. My friend Linda Stewart, who is a life cycle celebrant, often speaks about this concept, and I encourage you to look her up. She's fantastic. So with that said, I want to introduce the concept of the grief box. Inside this box is a ball. We will call it the grief ball. And inside this box is also a button, which we will call the pain button. When you first experience grief, the ball is huge and it's more likely to hit the button, sometimes constantly in the beginning. But over time, the ball shrinks. As the ball gets smaller, it's less likely to hit the button in the box. The key point here is that it's less likely to hit the button. When it does hit that button as a result of an upcoming birthday, anniversary, or song that you hear on the radio that brings back memories, even if it's a tiny little button, the sadness and the anxiety and depression and everything else you felt when you first went through the grief will feel as if it's brand new again. Grief will never go away and you'll never get over it, as some people will tell you. Relating back to your pre-loss state and post-loss state, you need to find and settle into a new reality in your post-loss phase. The importance of processing your grief is that it becomes lighter to carry, regardless of your age, gender, social status, or otherwise. So today we've learned that what grief is and what you can use, what can cause it, such as birthdays, retirement, home buying, and death. We've looked at what grief can look and feel like, such as the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical aspects that are affected by grief. We've also looked at how you can navigate grief and the ways to communicate with others, such as letting them choose their own adventure, going through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and suggested comments and questions to use when speaking with someone. As we end the presentation, I would love to hear in your own words some of your takeaways from today or things you may have thought during the presentation. If you're comfortable, you can feel free to post comments in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and we can have a discussion and ask questions.
I just want to say quickly, this was so lovely, and like my group had such a lovely conversation in our subgroup, if you want to call it that. And we touched on so many of the things we talked about in the Jam board as well. And like, just been a very lovely experience today. So thank you, Maria. This was amazing.
My pleasure.
Hey, Maria, I just had a question. When you put things that we shouldn't say, one of them was, I can't imagine what you're going through. I find I say that a lot. So I was just wondering why is that not like a good thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes when people say, I can't imagine what you're going through, there's a likely possibility that there will be at some point in your life, you will have to go through that experience, whether it's the death of a parent, a spouse, just a loved one. So it's almost as if you're othering the other person's experience and you could never imagine going through something like that. So in that context, it would be best, at least from my experience, to acknowledge that their experience is unique, as opposed to kind of othering it.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
No worries.
Maria,
Good question.
it's Jan Linner. I'm just wondering if, how do you get through multiple deaths at the same time? It's been really difficult in the last 3 years. I've lost my mom and my dad and my 18-month-old granddaughter, and I just lost my brother-in-law. And I'm finding that the grief is buried and I can't seem to let it out.
Yeah, I'm not a trained therapist or psychologist or anything like that, so keep that in mind. My suggestion for anyone who is going through moments of grief is definitely to find a therapist. That would be my first suggestion. And similar to when I was having my conversation with Olga, one of the comments that she said was moving your body, and going through the motions lets you feel things. So if you want to increase physical activity, that may unlock something inside of you if you want to take that approach. But definitely first line of defense is finding a therapist that you feel comfortable speaking to and sharing with.
Okay, and I'm in that process, so that's good. Thanks.
Of course.
It's Ray here, Maria.
Hey, Ray.
Hi. The grief box that you presented, I think that's great. I have had trouble just understanding and explaining and helping people with the changes, and that whole issue of closure is a really difficult one, as you know. People use that, I think, in a not a very helpful way. So the grief box was, for me, that was a kind of a highlight today. That visual of the grief box. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for, of course. Thank you for noting that. Yeah, a few years ago, I was struggling in terms of explaining like what grief is in terms of how you feel it and process it. So this visual explanation, to me, I'm a visual person, definitely. So when I saw this, I was like, yeah, I definitely need to incorporate this into the presentation.
Thank you.
Of course.
Maria, there was a question about who actually related to the Choose Your Own Adventure for Grief, the surname of Susan, the person who came up with that. Just, I guess people are wanting to know more about this person who came up with this brilliant idea.
So Susan told me about what she does when, I'll get her name, give me 1 second, when she's supporting someone. And I jokingly said to her, it's like Choose Your Own Adventure book. And she laughed. So please don't go messaging her and telling her that she said that. But I can get you her name. I just want to make sure I spell it right. And I will add it in the chat in a moment.
And we also have another question from Peter asking about what complicates the grief process sometimes.
That's a great question. So what can complicate grieving processes? I'll go back to that slide actually. This is a very surface level example when it comes to like gender relationship with the loss. So specifically, I can give an example where, let's say you have a strained relationship with a parent and you are, you want to be close with them, but again, it's strained. When they end up dying, there's a lot of complicated emotions that may arise for individuals where there's almost a relief that they have passed on, and almost as if they feel guilty for not feeling bad. So that's an example of when grief can get complicated. Or let's say, maybe another example, let's say someone that you dated years and years and years ago, and you haven't seen them in 10 years, you all of a sudden find out that they have moved on. And societally, there's the expectation that you haven't seen them in 10 years. What do you care? It's no big deal. Though the relationship that you had with that person could have been very impactful to your entire life, to the trajectory of everything that you've done. And you almost have to balance what people expect of you and with your grief versus what you're actually feeling. So those are a couple of examples I can say when it comes to complications with grief.
Another thing I just want to make sure to note as well is that complicated grief disorder is a it's a diagnosable psychological issue that comes with its own parameters. And so it's basically when grief, the intense feelings of loss are debilitating and they don't improve over time as you process. And so if that is something that you're struggling with, or that someone you know is struggling with, definitely professional mental health support is advisable. And you know, some of that may come from the examples that you offered. And so I just want to also make sure that people, there is complications within grief, but then there's also the actual formal diagnosis, just so people are aware and there's not confusion. It does get confusing when there's normal terminology that actually is a diagnosable disorder. So yeah.
Wonderful call out. Thank you for that.
I just had a question too. Maybe it is complicated grief, but when you are grieving, how do you know if it's beyond grief, like when it's maybe going into a depression, or what is the difference between grief and depression? Because they seem pretty similar in some.
I would say depression can be a result of grief. And Kat, feel free to also jump in. I would say depression is a result of grief and something that people can experience following the loss of someone or something that they love. And there can be moments where it can last for a couple of days, weeks, months. And again, it's dependent on the person. Being able to recognize that, oh, I've been in this dark place for quite a bit of time. And calling that out is a good step forward in terms of pulling yourself out of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so we also have a question about, well, I'm going to say it in advance, anticipatory grief. Sherry is asking about grieving. How do you grieve when the person is still alive? And for example, the example she gives is in the case of divorce.
Yeah. My friend Linda Stewart, she's a life cycle celebrant. I briefly mentioned her today. And she creates rituals. She creates new rituals around situations. And one of the situations that she mentioned to me was doing a divorce ceremony. So finding new rituals revolving around that and turning it into an act of remembrance. So we do that for birthdays, for example, doing something else for divorce. So she jokingly said one time, taking the wedding dress and like burning it or something, or gathering all of your closest friends and going out and making something of it. So turning it into a moment, turning it into an experience as opposed to this thing that you need to avoid. So leaning into what you're feeling in that moment.
That's great. That leads really well into Christine. She had a follow-up question about how you cope when regarding divorce, how you cope when others think it's a good thing, or if it's a time to celebrate. How do you navigate those emotions you're feeling with the expectations of those around you of how you're going to cope with that situation?
In terms of avoiding having it seen as a positive, or?
Yeah, or how do you approach that process of grieving the loss of the relationship when people think, oh, this is a good thing? You know, if the relationship affected you negatively, you should be glad that it's over, but that might not represent where you are in your process in coping with the loss.
Well, yeah, I'll say I would think that we don't marry people we don't like most of the time, right? So there are going to be positives from the relationship, at the same time balancing with the aspects that inevitably led to the need for a divorce. My advice to that is communication is paramount. It's so challenging. I mentioned self-advocating for yourself is one of the hardest things that you can do in normal times, quote unquote. When you're grieving, it's even harder. So being surrounded by people who are asking those questions, or having yourself explain what you need, whether it's a glass of water or just going out for tea, communication is 100% the top of mind that comes.
If we're, it's right here, if we're looking ways to support ourselves or to support others, I guess one of the secrets or the tricks would be to figure out what support we need, and then to, as you say, self-advocate or reach out to those people that we know will understand and communicate well with us, as opposed to those that are that may not understand those processes. So it's self-advocating for our own support is a good one, I think.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think also when we're trying to support someone who is grieving as well, is supporting them to advocate for themselves is also important. If they're not in a position where they can advocate for themselves easily, or they might not know what they need, giving them the support they need, or the prompts to say, what do you need? And to help them build that confidence to be able to advocate for themselves. So a lot of the things that Maria was talking about with, what do you say to someone who's grieving would apply to doing that. So we've got some questions. All right, Sherry. So Sherry has questions about grieving versus depression. Your question about medication, whether it's required, that's really the best person to do that would be your personal medical professional, whether that's your family doctor, or someone like that in terms of medical opinions. Each person is different. Each person dealing with grief is different, and each person dealing with depression is different. And so you might need something different depending. So chronic grief or chronic sorrow was recognized recently as a factor that can contribute to cause depression. It wasn't before, and now it is. So hopefully that helps people access the support they need. But in terms of medication, it's really up to mental health professionals in each individual case. And Jan, thank you for your comment about the grief ball and the grief button. More people responding really positively to that.
Danielle has a question.
Hi, Maria.
Hey.
Love the presentation. It was great, as always. I just wanted to hear more about your podcast, and if people haven't listened before, do you recommend certain season or episode to start with, or a favorite episode of yours to kind of dip your toe in, or how would you recommend going about that?
Yeah, you can check us out at filotimolife.com. I'll share the link in the chat. And I'm a little bit biased because this is probably our most recent episode. It talks about death in Disney and how to talk to your kids about death, which I think is, being someone whose mom died when I was a kid, I think is paramount when broaching the topic. So if you are interested in Disney movies and reliving your childhood by chance, I definitely recommend checking that out. We also have an episode that talks about Western ideologies when it comes to death. So going back to, I think, the 1500s to present day. At the time when the book was published, it was 1970s, I think, around that time, by Philip Aries, who was a French medievalist. And he discusses how over the course of time, we were very comfortable with death. And now, thanks to medical advancements, which are great, they've also resulted in us being fearful of death. So I definitely recommend those two episodes to get you started.
Sorry, I'm just getting caught up on the chat here. People are sharing some great, or chatting about, between themselves as well, which is wonderful. Yeah, Stacy responding to, so Christine, Yeah, Christine was following up on her comment about how you're grieving versus how others are expecting you to feel differently about your loss, whatever that loss might be. And Christine was just echoing that it's okay to have that difference in experience or perspective, and that should be valued, and we need to do a better job, which is why, and I will be the CHPCA person who plugs our campaign for National Grief and Bereavement Day, which is when I grieve, I feel. And then we left it blank on purpose because everybody has a different experience and we need to talk about it. You know, the 5 steps of grief don't encompass everything that everybody experiences. And we need to talk about that because grief on its own can be incredibly isolating. You know, we think people couldn't possibly understand, and that's why we want everybody to start sharing their unique experience about grief. You know, when you grieve, how do you feel? So that other people who might be in the throes of it, who might not be able to talk about it right now, can at least see that other people are experiencing those same things and they're not alone. And so, yeah, so Stacey and Christine, like a lot of what you said, you know, we need to do a better job of sharing that we need to advocate for ourselves, yes, but we also need to listen to others who are advocating for themselves, that what they're going through might not match what we think they're going through, and that's okay. And so if there are any other questions, we can definitely address them. We're coming close to the end of the hour. So if anybody else wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or make a comment, or ask it in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. So unless there are any other questions, on behalf of the CHPCA team, I want to extend a very special thank you to Maria for her presentation today. We thank everyone today who registered and joined us, and thank you for honoring National Grief and Bereavement Day by taking the time today to learn and to think about helping ourselves when we grieve and helping those around us when they're grieving. If you want to share how you feel when you grieve, you can find our shareable poster on at CHPCA/bereavement day. I'll share the link in the chat. There's a fillable poster and you can post it online or post it with a selfie and engage that way. I'm also going to be sending a survey link to the chat about your webinar experience. Please fill it out. Your responses are incredibly helpful to us when we're planning future webinars and what content might be interesting for more people. And the webinar session was recorded, and we'll be circulating that along with the slides that were presented once everything is compiled and edited together. So we'll be circulating that to everyone by email. And so thank you everybody for joining us today and for your amazing participation, and for everyone who shared their stories. Thank you for your vulnerability, and thank you for honoring us with your story. Maria, if you have any closing words, feel free.
Thank you for having me today. It was great to connect and speak with you guys, and hopefully be back soon.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a lovely day.